Good afternoon, everybody. You got your coffee? Still awake? We're gonna liven you up a little bit. So this is the government panel. Government. Um, couple announcements first. You can provide questions to us as a panel on Slido. So you go to slido.com, #realizingdemocracy, especially for those of you on the 10th floor. There's still some seats up here, by the way, for those of you that want to come upstairs. So feel free to come in and find a seat. And then just to say thanks again to all the organizers and co-organizers. And there's so many people in this room. I actually think I'm Facebook friends with every single body in this room, even though I'm not on Facebook. And thanks, Chris, for co-founding it, but I don't use it. So, but it's great to see everybody. It's great to see all of you. Liz Watson is laughing back there from Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, and Thea Lee from EPI, and there's just a range of folks and organizers. I think I saw Jesse Graham from Maine's People Alliance. Hey, Kevin. So anyway, hi to everybody in the room. This is going to be a really exciting panel because we have some people I really, really admire, and I have been a fan of theirs for a long time, some of whom I followed their careers since they were graduate students on this stage. So let me quickly introduce who they are, and then we're going to get into the conversation. So first we have Alex Hertel-Fernandez, who's an assistant professor of international public affairs at Columbia University and author of State Capture, which came out this year, a must-read book of the year. You can clap. Clap. Thank you, Megan. Jamila Michener, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University and author of another must-read book of the year, Fragmented Democracy. Welcome. Lorella Praley, who when she was invited to this panel, let me just say before you think there's corruption happening up here. So she was at the ACLU as the National Political Director and Head of Immigrant Rights. She, as of next Monday, is the President of Community Change Action and Vice President of Community Change. And I'm very happy to be a team with her. And last but not least, who you saw in the video, Councilwoman Helen Gim of the Philadelphia City Council and Vice Chair of Local Progress. Please welcome everyone. So on the last panel, Sabile had 3 framing questions. We have 5. I'm not going to get to all of them, but at the essence of all of our questions, so what are the root causes underneath inequality and institutional crises of democracy? What kind of policy and governmental structures are needed to govern? I can go on and on. But really, we're going to talk about power and governance on this panel. Yeah? Power and governance in American democracy. And so just to start, I was thinking a lot about this in preparation. There's an old Buddhist saying that the self is not a noun, it's a verb. We are all verbs as people. We're always becoming. I think about democracy in the same way. Like, yeah, it's a noun, but it's also a verb, and especially in the American context. Democracy, for sure, and realizing democracy is the constant struggle. Felicia earlier on the panel before us talked about policies and power. And in many ways, this reminded me of the old political science book title by Harold Lasswell, Politics is Who Gets What, When, and How. And so I want to dig into who is at the table of power, what do they get, when do they get it, and how do they get it, the means, and that's really where I think we're going to focus in terms of governing institutions. But then there's a question of who builds and sets the table of power in the first place. Who builds and sets the table of power in the first place? So with that, I want to start with a repeated mantra in our world, I think from Justice Brandeis, that states are the laboratories of democracy. Maybe you heard that before? States are the laboratories of democracies. And we always assume that that kind of means a sort of progressive federalism. We can try out things when we're blocked at the federal level. But I once heard of this thing called Jim Crow. That was kind of born in the laboratory of democracy in states, right? So I think we have to be more sophisticated about how we think about this. So I want to actually turn to our first 2 panelists to really ask the question, how does state policy and state government structure or constrain opportunities for progress, particularly for ordinary people and for marginalized people? So I'm going to ask Alex. I was thinking of your book because he writes a lot about Alec. I'm going to ask Alex and Jamila to go first on this question and talk to us about, particularly, this is the teaser for the book, but make sure you buy it. What's the role of states, and how should we be thinking about state governmental structures in constraining or enabling opportunity?
Thanks so much, Dorian, both for the question, the kind introduction, and for the opportunity to talk today. It's a real privilege to be here in a room full of people who I've learned from so much in doing this research. So I think that the states are the right place to start looking for the quality of democracy for a couple of reasons, one of which is simply that they are constitutive of our democracy. They came together to form this country. They're also an important site of policymaking, as Dorian underlined. It's a place where people set policy that governs the social and economic conditions that people live through every day. And then the third reason is that we live in a federated democracy in which the states are substantively important political units for making change in this country. And when you look back at successful social movements over the course of history, they have nearly always been built through and across the states. So I think it's right to focus here on federalism in the states in this way. And as Dorian alluded to, there are a number of places where the states have succeeded in creating a more inclusive democracy. I think about efforts to raise the minimum wage and the failure of the federal government's move to raise the minimum wage. Some 2.2 million people are affected by local minimum wages, and another 3.7 million are affected by higher state-level minimum wages, and there have been important gains made in LGBT employment discrimination and climate change as well. But there are also some warning signs, and some of these warning signs are things that we've known about throughout our history. Dorian had pointed to the ugly history of racial exclusion that was conducted and built at the state level. But I can think of some more contemporary examples today. And indeed, when I was putting together my notes for this presentation yesterday, I was reminded of this with a North Carolina legislature that decided to take advantage of Democrats leaving for a 9/11 memorial to pass an override to the veto of the governor's budget that was trying to expand, that was vetoed because it did not expand Medicaid. But we can look to many other examples of the states limiting a more inclusive economic and political democracy in recent years. I think about efforts to roll back access to the ballot box, but I also think about efforts that go beyond that too, to limit organization and association. As Tom Perriello reminded us this morning, democracy is more than just elections, and so efforts to roll back the right of people to organize in labor unions, to form civil society associations, and indeed to exercise their rights to petition government. These are all ways in which the states are rolling back access to democracy. I also think about efforts to roll back initiatives that citizens have passed on their own, trying to bypass legislatures that are unresponsive to them. We've seen this in a number of cases where citizens have come together to pass ballot initiatives to expand Medicaid, for instance, or the minimum wage. And so in all of these ways, I think we're seeing some important retrenchments at the state level. So what are behind these retrenchments of an inclusive economic and political democracy? I think there are some factors, some institutional factors about the states that are important to highlight, and there are some organizational developments as well. So we might think of those as the agents who are creating these impediments and the sort of institutions that they're taking advantage of. So what are the institutional features of the states that have made it possible for actors to retrench an inclusive political and economic democracy? Well, for one thing, I think about the lack of salience and ability for citizens to hold state government accountable. When the founders were envisioning what a republic would look like, there was an assumption that people would be closer, both cognitively and physically, to their state politicians. And while that might have been the case at the turn of centuries ago, that's no longer the case today. Many citizens do not know which party controls the legislature or who serves as governor, and therefore has a hard time holding their state politicians accountable. And that's compounded by the fact that we've seen a decline in news media coverage of state and local political issues. Layered on top of that is a trend of nationalization of state and local politics, so that people are increasingly casting their ballots for state and local offices based on national issues. Why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because it means that state politicians can pass policies that are unresponsive to the preferences of their citizens without any sort of price that they pay at the ballot box. If citizens aren't casting their ballots based on what's being done at the state level, but rather these national level cleavages, then they can get away with doing things like refusing to expand Medicaid, passing increases to the minimum wage, or passing unpopular cutbacks to labor organizing rights. The final institutional feature of the state that I think is problematic that we should put on the table is the very low resources we dedicate to state legislatures. And as part of this Ford project, I've been working with a representative from Florida, Representative Carlos Smith, and it's been incredibly illuminating, both my conversations with him and the research that I did for State Capture, to really get a picture of just how few resources we give our lawmakers. Many of them across the states have salaries that require them to take on second or third jobs. They're lucky if they get one or two staffers that they might have to share with other lawmakers, and sessions only meet for a few months a year. This leaves state legislatures, as I show in my research, incredibly dependent on outside groups for policy ideas, legislation, and help. And those outside groups, all too often, are groups that are funded by wealthy donors and private sector interests that are eager to retrench political and economic democracy. So I think it's important that we get the diagnosis for what's wrong with our political institutions at the state and local level right, so that we can start thinking about organizing and changing institutions in ways that would facilitate a more equitable democracy.
All right. Wow, that's a lot to follow, not to mention the last panel. So it's really an honor for me to be on this panel, in particular with Dorian Warren, who taught me my very first semester in graduate school. And I had to say it. I was so deeply and paralyzingly intimidated by Dorian, by his brilliance, really. His personality was warm and welcoming, but his brilliance was staggering at the time.
At the time. This has been downhill from here. 20 years later.
You didn't let me finish. I was going to say it continues to be. Oh, my goodness. Wow. Okay. Hard crowd. I'm working on a project right now with two co-authors of mine, one at the University of Washington, Jake Grumbach, and another one at Marquette, Phil Rocco. And we're actually working on developing an index to measure the quality of democracy in the states. And part of what sort of inspired this idea was just the work that I do and the work that that the three of us have done around federalism. All three of us are involved with an organization called Scholar Strategy Network, and we were like, we can get with SSN, we can figure out how to do this research and how to take it beyond ourselves. And we thought a lot about this idea of states as laboratories of democracy. And my co-author, Phil Rocco, said to me, well, I don't know about that, but I think that states are observatories of democracy. We can watch them, and we can understand more about democracy by watching them, not just individually, right, by understanding what happens in Florida or California or New York or what have you, but by looking at what all of that individual activity amounts to, right? And thinking about that in relation to how we understand democracy, and in particular, for my purposes, how we understand inequality, in particular class-based and race-based inequality, right? So that's the lens through which I come to this idea of states as not really laboratories, but observatories of democracy. And what do we observe when we look at states? A number of things. I'll point out three things here just for the sake of being quick, because there are just so many brilliant people. I cannot take up too much space. One of the things that we see when we look at states as observatories and we try to understand what they're teaching us about democracy is that they're subsidizing tremendous geographic inequality, right? Federalism is about a lot of things, but one of the things that it's about at sort of a core level is inequality, right? Because what I get in New York is different than what I get in Minnesota, is different than what I get in Mississippi, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not necessarily inherently bad, but in the context of a larger political economy, where there's not necessarily a floor that's high enough to ensure that wherever you are, you're getting enough, right? You're getting what you need, and you're having a voice, well then in that context, that kind of geographic inequality is a real problem, right? And on top of it, and this is the crux of the problem in my view, and this is what my book focuses on, Fragmented Democracy, is that that kind of geographic inequality has direct consequences for democracy, right? For a number of different reasons. One, I focus on Medicaid and Medicaid beneficiaries. And what I see and what I find from talking to people in states all across the country is that their experiences with Medicaid in particular are dramatically different depending on where they live, not just on the state level, but also depending on where they live in terms of counties, in terms of localities, in terms of neighborhoods, right? And there's a whole lot under the hood that explains that, but here's what's key. People know that. They understand that their experiences vary arbitrarily based on something as simple as a county line or a state line. That if I cross the border over into New York and I live in New Jersey, I'm gonna have something different. And if I cross over into Pennsylvania and I live in New Jersey, I'm gonna have something different. And that sends a really important message, right? That your social rights aren't fundamental on account of your human dignity, but that they are contingent on account of where you live and whether or not you happen to be lucky enough to live in a state where your dignity is more or less likely to be respected. And that message has implications for how people engage politically, not just in terms of going to the polls and voting on election day, but in terms of how they engage in their local neighborhoods, whether or not they're going to engage with a local political group, and so on and so forth. So the geographic inequality that federalism breeds is not just this abstract thing that we all know is true, but hey, that's the system that we live in. It has really direct consequences for democracy. Quickly, I have to move quicker than this. The second thing I want to point out is that states, in addition to sort of breeding this geographic inequality almost by default by doing what it is they want to do, and in some places that's giving more and in other places it's giving much, much less, they've also, in many ways and in large part, abandoned cities and localities, right? And sort of the implications of this are manifold, but one of the implications is, first of all, around the resources that localities have for making change in their communities. I love what Helen said in the video about the idea that if we can't make change here where we live, we're certainly not going to be able to address the demagogues at the national level, right? This morning, I came late, and the reason I came late was because I spent the morning at a settlement house in Queens, which is where I grew up. Shout out to Queens. And they work with 25,000 low-income people living in poverty every year, helping to provide them with a range of services. And I spent my morning talking to them about how they can not just provide these folks with services, but think about how to position them to have power, right? How to use the services that they have the resources to provide in a different way. And they were super open to that, but talked about the challenges of doing that in the context of a federal government that is in a mode of retrenchment, and even of a state government that is periodically, sometimes more, sometimes less, in a mode of retrenchment when it comes to supporting local level activities, right? And so states play a role, not just with respect to what they're doing relative to other states, but with respect to how it is that they are positioning cities and sub-localities, neighborhoods, in terms of their ability to not just help, but also empower people. And the final thing I'll point out, and this is really important, which is why I want to end with it, is that states play a role in perpetuating racial inequality. We all know this, and Dorian really, incisively pointed us to this when he said, well, Jim Crow, that was also cooked up in the laboratories of democracy in the states. But that hasn't stopped now, right? And in some of the examples that Alex gave us around Medicaid expansion or around voter suppression, around minimum wage, and many other examples that we could all name, right? You name it and we can talk about it. The states that are often the most regressive and the most retrenching are also the places where there are the most Black and brown folks, right? And so it's not as though the kind of inequality that they're perpetuating is equally distributed. It is disproportionately concentrated among often the most vulnerable communities, right? And as those resources are being pulled away from those communities through state and correspondingly local policies, it means that those communities are less well positioned to engage politically, right? So it's not just about resources, it's about power. And those two things are linked, and they're linked to what states are doing and all the way down, right? And so what this means for us is what I hope that we'll take up in the conversation to follow. And I think it links to a lot of the other things that have emerged, that emerged in the previous panel and that have emerged in the Q&A around how do we position ourselves going forward so that we're in a better position to do better, you know, as we proceed. How do we think about coalition building, knowing that federalism can create opportunities for building coalitions, but it can also make it really difficult to build coalitions because we're in our silos in states or in localities and not thinking about the sort of aggregate patterns that emerge from that. So there are tons of questions that come from this, and I'm looking forward to thinking together with you all about that.
So thank you, Alex and Jamila, for depressing us with all the bad news. So no pressure, other side of the panel, because I'm going to turn to you. So Council Member Gim, I'm looking at sort of the organizers in the room. So Andrea from New Florida Majority, who's organizing the whole state of Florida. And I bring her up because before you were on the City Council of Philadelphia, you were a community organizer for 2 decades. So if you were to give advice to Andrea or your former self from where you sit now about how to create opportunities for inclusive governance that leads to justice and freedom and equity, what would that advice be?
So thank you very much. And so I guess I should say just a little bit about myself because I find it fascinating that a deeply anti-authoritarian, disruptive, rabble-rousing community organizer is talking about governance and power. Because like to this day, I still feel that power resides outside of city halls and state legislatures and federal government, even though they wield the tools that power brings, which is like money, resources, budget, housing, whatever we want to talk about, laws. But I still feel like I want to not think that because you're not sitting in these seats that somehow you have relinquished power. I think that's one of the most fundamental things in terms of like upending this idea of what do we do in this moment, or who are we, or what does the future even look like. So fundamentally, for me, coming in as a city council member, I've thought a lot about what it means to have collaborative governance. Basically, how do you co-create government when all the aspects of what Alex and Jamila were talking about push people away to the outside margins. I also want to say very quickly is that like I spent 20 years working in communities that just never had a pathway to power, represented Asian American immigrant communities that are fodder for the for-profit private prison industry long before this administration came into place. I've been part of public education communities who had to fight off a 17-year state takeover of our public schools that stripped us of our resources, closed down public schools, expanded privatization, fired teachers left and right, and really tried to eat at communities from the heart, which is our children's lives and their very health. And from each and every stage, I would say that what we would miss, we would be wrong to miss, is to think that people have not figured out other levers of power. And that, in fact, what is so important for the donors and funders in this room to look at organizers is that we have tried to understand that there is a different type of power structure that comes into play when you are isolated outside of power structures. It means that we find voice in new models of leadership. It means that the types of leadership that we're looking for is not based on traditional notions of leadership that get you traditionally elected to office. It means that even like an economy can be based on bartering and mutual exchange and joy and benefit and an exchange of trust as much as it is, even perhaps more than it is, on a notion of profit. And so, you know, knowing those things, I would say to my former self and to all the organizers in this room that power still lies within all of us, and that it was a hard decision for me to talk about running for political office. It's not that I don't want to, but I had to think very differently about how I had operated externally. And the biggest transfer is that you go into a form of what is called co-creation or collaborative governance, which is that, as you heard in the video, one very clear example of this is when I came in, we were still under a 17-year state takeover. We didn't have nurses and counselors in our public schools. We had to send thousands of kids to summer school every single year because they didn't even have a teacher in the classroom for 2/3 of the year. That's how dramatic the situation was. And then suddenly I came into office running on a strong public education agenda, saying that we can turn this around. And so the question is, well, can you? And the answer is, if I'm one of 17 city council members, that answer is no, I cannot do that. So you go out there and you start reestablishing the norms and the public responsibilities of what is possible in government, even before the resources are there, even before the political will is there. Because if you truly believe in co-creation and people power, then you will believe that a mass number of people can reshape the boundaries of what's possible. I'll say this also really quickly, like one of the things that I think about is, what's possible is often determined about who gets to talk about these things of what's possible, right? And so if you are limited in those, then you want to dramatically expand the number of people who get to participate in what's possible. So when we went out and did education town halls, we brought in thousands of people from across the city who surprisingly had pretty common consensus notions of what priorities ought to look like in their public schools. It essentially meant safety. It essentially meant security. You can just tick down the numbers of things that you are able to develop from that. So then you step out a little further and you talk about, again, that when I present something within city council, I'm not simply trying to present a bill or pass a policy or celebrate a law. I'm building a campaign. I want everything that I pass through to be a campaign that drives people into City Hall, drives them out to talk about what we can do, makes new connections, strengthens the relationship between myself and the communities that I feel accountable to, as much as I do to any other entity that is in the elected political world. But more so than that, I want to let the people, my colleagues, and others know that we're coming. I'm not into ambush politics. I'm not into the surprise element. That has nothing to do with me. It is like, this is a commonly created human rights agenda about getting people the essential basic services that they need to the most robust effort. And we are going to go out there and we are going to take it. And the question is not, can you do it? Are the odds on your side? How many votes do you have? It is like, you will know we were coming, and if you don't know that we're coming, that's on me. Then I've got to go out there, organize more, expand the table more, be more clear and loud, and bring more people in. That's how we change power and power dynamics, relationships. It's how you create a sense of accountability for governance. And that's how we transform what we're trying to do here, that government, elected office, politics, all about that. It doesn't start with politicians. It has always started with a sense of us. It has always started with us going out there, organizing, and getting what we're organized to take.
Wow. Okay, Lorella.
I'm ready to sign up for the shift. Tell me where I gotta go.
I want to try to connect this conversation to the first conversation of the day, which is about civil society. And so for you, Lorella, you've actually talked to me a lot about how you see the role of social movements in this country as changing the rules, institution structures to realize democracy, to empower people. So from where you sit, in terms of the last, say, 10 years of your life and work, what do you see going forward, and connect to the council member's advice to her former self? What do movements need to do in this moment to further empower people in terms of governing power? And how should we be thinking about, I'm really curious, and I want to come back to the whole panel in a minute with this, how should we be thinking about co-governance as you described it for us? So talk to us about...
First, can you guys hear me? Okay, I can't tell with this mic. But I think I want to start by just saying there's so much of everything that you all said that has resonated with me and my own sort of becoming in the United States, because I was not born here, and it wasn't just I think of politics and social movements as working to make ourselves of some account, right? And that is not my quote. And when I was undocumented growing up in the state of Connecticut, we were not even US citizens. We didn't have the power of the vote. And so when you say the power rests with the people, I believe that deeply. I believe that in my core because I have lived it. And I have lived it, and I have fought with people who were made invisible, who were made to be intimidated by an enforcement apparatus, and who found their voice and understood that even though they could not vote, that even though we could not vote, we could use our voice, our presence, that we could enter the public sphere to make our demands known and to hold people accountable to meet those demands. And I think that the experiment and the movement that Dreamers, for example, have built in this country is exactly that. And that organizing makes the impossible possible. And so I think of the coming years, and there's this big question that is sort of center in the immigrants' rights movement right now, and that is, do we go back to Obama-era policies and structures, or do we push for more? And my answer right now is that question is completely irrelevant to me. It's a non-question. Like, I can't even entertain the idea of going back to the way things were under the Obama administration, because the moment that we have today is the opportunity to reimagine the way that the system, the way that the structures of government, the institutions that government has put in place need to be upended, reimagined, and reconfigured, right? And so when I think about the role of the enforcement apparatus in the United States, I don't want to talk right now, especially because my cousin was apprehended by CBP last week. I don't want to talk about how to reform, how to do minor changes here and there, but understand that our immigration system is not broken. Our immigration system was made to work in this way, and it wasn't made to work and operate in this way just by Republicans, but it was a bipartisan effort to co-create the kind of system that Trump inherited and has exploited to terrorize people of color and immigrants. Right? And so I feel like for social movements and sort of thinking of my younger self before I went into DC and I was in Connecticut and it was all about organizing, is going back to that. And just remembering how important it is, what I would tell myself, my younger self and myself today is just to remember to dream big and to remember that we've got the power. Right? And to actually think about what does transformative policy change look like for us today? What is the scale of the movements we need to build? And to, frankly, make sure that we're not letting go of deep organizing because we feel like mobilization is what's hot right now, because that's not going to save us, right? To think as social movements that we're not, like the party's not going to save us, right? This idea that the Democratic Party or any other party is going to go out and do the registering of our people to make sure that they turn out, it's not happening, right? It's on us to deliver that for our people with our people, right? And to know that the best solutions really do come up from the ground up, that we don't have all the solutions in DC, that if you ask me today, how do we reform the enforcement system, I shouldn't be able to answer that question on my own, but I should be engaging deeply with people who feel that system ever more closely on the day-to-day experience of their lives to think about how we imagine our future together.
Okay, so I want to start where you just left off, Lorella, because you said the immigration system isn't broken, and in some ways you could argue Congress isn't broken, state houses aren't broken, Alex, city councils aren't broken, our democracy's not broken. It's actually designed to do exactly what it does. As a black person, that's like really resonant for me, right? Because it's not like democracy peacefully resolved the slavery question. We didn't have a democratic resolution to that. We had a bloody war. Right? So if the system was set up, if that's the premise of the question, so the immigration policy to everything, right? Our institutions of governance, if they're broken, they were set up that way, then it gives one pause if our goal is just to have more diverse faces in those institutions without changing those institutions. I grew up in Chicago, so, you know, Rainbow Coalition is a big deal in my young life. I believe in like a rainbow multiracial democracy. What I don't want is a rainbow oligarchy. I don't want a rainbow oligarchy. And so, Lorella, something else you said, and I want to pose this to all of you and allow you to respond to anything each other said, is then what you invited us to reimagine political institutions and power today. So I want to ask all of you, how should we be thinking about that? How should we be reimagining together? That's about transformation, not simply inclusion into structures that were designed to exclude us. So how should we be thinking about reimagining of state governmental structures or city councils or Congress even, or I don't know, the Electoral College? Take your pick. But inspire us? How should we reimagine our democracy to further realize it?
No pressure.
Yeah, and a minute or less, too. I should have looking around at the organizers.
I guess I could start if, so it's a great question, and I think in some ways it allows us to touch on the questions of coalition building that Jamila brought up and that were touched on in the last panel. I think that when I look at the successful movements on the ideological right, concentrated economic interests that have been successful in changing institutions and policy across the states, they have been good at thinking about policy not just as a means of changing social and economic outcomes, but of changing politics. First and foremost. That, for instance, when you prioritize tort reform, you're not just economically benefiting the industries or the businesses that are concerned about claims being brought against them by consumers or by their employees. You're also weakening a key political constituency, the trial lawyer bench that funds your opponents, that pushes for policies in the other direction. And I think nowhere is this clearer than with the cutbacks to union rights that you've seen across the states. And research that I and others have done have shown that this has not only weakened labor movements, but has had large downstream political consequences. So I think one place to start is to think about these hooks, to use Sabine and Holly Gilman's phrase, these hooks that policies can create that either mobilize constituencies, piece together new coalitions, or can divide them in important ways.
All right. That's a really hard question. I think that I want to sort of amplify and echo something that Lorella said about not being able to sort of answer that question with just the folks who are in the room at present, right? Because a kind of reimagination, in my view, means like recentering whose voices get to tell us what the radical future should look like, right? And frankly, it shouldn't be our voices that are at the center of that discussion. And so the question is, how can we make sure that not just in rooms like this, but in every kind of room, whether it's in a state house or among city council members or organizers or what have you, how can we have people who are actually experiencing the consequences of the various dysfunctional forms of governance that we're talking about and the consequences of public policy? And some of that means actually just building power in communities and base building and taking the people who frankly feel like, they couldn't possibly be involved because they're just too vulnerable or there's too much going on in their lives or they're not knowledgeable enough, and really thinking creatively and radically about how to censor those people's voices, not be a voice for them, but create formations that have space for their voices, right? So I don't know in policy terms, I don't know what a kind of radical reimagining looks like, but whatever I would come up with shouldn't be what the answer is.
I want to shout out, I don't know if Deirdre is still in the room. Sister over there is doing a lot of thinking and leading a lot of work on really thinking about how to restore power to the people. And I think we should all be in that conversation. But I want to sort of link back to two moments in my life. One was in 2010 when I was sitting in the Senate gallery, and Congress had, or the Senate had just voted on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then moved to a vote on the DREAM Act. And we got 55 votes for the DREAM Act, 41 votes against. And if we had not had a filibuster back then, we would be in year 9 of implementing the DREAM Act, 3 years away from Dreamers having US citizenship and being able to petition for their parents. So, you know, sort of if we think about democratic reforms and how to make sure the democracy is working for all people, I know that there's a lot of fear around what it would look like to eliminate the filibuster, but it has real life consequences right now. And if we think about our future 5 years from now and a potential different, hopeful, better outcome in a year from today or a year from November, then it's not going to be enough to actually have a blue trifecta at the federal level. We have to think deeply about the kind of reforms that we need to actually get these big transformative policies through. And then the other is, it's a conversation that I haven't really felt active here today, and that's the role of the media. Not necessarily as a tool of, or an institution of the government, but really as a vehicle that is every day informing citizens or doing the political education with everyday people. And so that brings me to 2016 when we lost the campaign, and from all the things that have come out of the Hillary campaign and everything that we've learned since, and the rise of misinformation. And so how are we thinking about making sure that more people have access to facts? And how are we creating facts when local newspapers are disappearing, when most people have access to one broadband network? I think that's 55% of Americans. And then the rest, the remaining, only have access to 2. And so how are we holding the media accountable? How is the media free and independent and working for people? And so I would just put those 2 things, and then, you know, this is really like a day-long conversation, but because the stakes are so high at the Supreme Court and across all the federal courts, and we're seeing Republicans pack the courts, and I know that they're going to hear the case on DACA on November 12th, then we also have to be thinking about what is possible at the Supreme Court and all the way down. But this idea that people, you know, get to sit for a life term and can really have significant consequences on every single one of the issues that we work on to advance the lives of people. But there's more, so.
Provocative council member.
Okay, so I think what I would say is that I feel sometimes that we have such limited notions of structures of governance, forms of power, that we tend to, as a result, just see things in a kind of binary. So like, I will never look to the right in any way, shape, or form for what I will study it, of course, and recognize what it is. But it is not a form of power. It's a form of oppression. And it is, for me, something that I will fundamentally reject, even when it builds out some type of thing that is being promoted. I also think that we tend to think of things hierarchical. So, you know, like, there's always like, you know, federal, state, local way at the bottom. And I think part of being on the city council, obviously I'm very biased, but, you know, but the reason why I was even considering an elected body and politics in general is because I felt like local politics was the closest nexus to the communities that I worked with, about the issues that I cared about, and about how we could actually take over something and just re-change it, and then change it dramatically for 1.5 million people in my own city. So while we wait for transformative change at the national level for a just immigration system, I will damn well make sure that Philadelphia is the strongest sanctuary city that protects each and every immigrant, that we will fund immigrant defense work, that we will end private prison imprisonment for immigrants and for Black and Brown and other communities all across our city of Philadelphia. And that there's also something very unique about local politics where, you know, sometimes at the national level it gets so hyper-factionalized. At the local level, you can root through these coalitions. So like, a lot of my work is thinking through that like I'm very conscious and hyper conscious about the abilities of some. And I apologize for using the word if it feels like strong, but hyper fetishizing certain types of issues. So like we're really all in on this issue, or we're really all in on this other issue, and we're all going in on whatever the issue is of the moment. When the reality is that on the ground, most people live multiple issues and problems at the same time. They lack housing. They're immigrants. They struggle to access educational rights. They have a criminal record, and so the factionalizing that you tend to see broadly is the stuff that we're trying to counter at the local level, that we actually want to build a common human rights-based agenda that takes us out of issues and puts communities of color accountable to one another in all the spaces in which our people are. And so it does matter to me a lot for my immigrant communities and for my AAPI communities to be hyper present in the criminal justice conversation, in questions about policing and the importance of a just system that is into hyper surveillance and monitoring and technology and all this kind of stuff, because it comes back within our communities. And it is deeply important that people who are involved in the education struggle are as involved in a struggle for housing, for clean water access, for rent control and renter protections. The failure to do that actually is the thing that I'm most afraid of. I'm least afraid of I'm not as afraid of power and money and sort of the oppressive networks, because I feel like we've lived them for so long that it's a given. We know that that's the odds. I am most afraid of apathy. I'm afraid of cynicism. I'm afraid of disinterest, a lack of humanity, of engagement, and a lack of ability to form connections that expand our possibilities for bigger and broader coalitions to take on bigger and broader battles. And so, that is like one essential part. The second thing that just deals very bluntly with like what goes on, and I think Alex, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm part of Local Progress. We're a national network of municipal officials, from water commissioners to school board members to mayors and district attorneys and township county commissioners. The one thing that became very clear is that there's a million programs when you run for office, and I don't want the rainbow oligarchy either, but I do want to change the kind of people who do come into office. So let me be clear about that. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there's a million programs to help you run for office. There are almost nothing once you get in. And if the same forces that would block you from getting in, if it's money, if it's power politics, if it's organizations and groups who don't back you, if it's a factionalized labor community, whatever it is, those things exist on the tenfold when you are trying to pass laws, when you're trying to govern, when you're trying to prove that somebody different coming in with a different background can govern differently. And fundamentally, that's why I'm invested in groups like Local Progress, where they're trying to form progressive governance academies, teaching people that you don't have to be afraid of the protests or the noise and the democracy that is shaping itself out in the streets, that's fundamentally where your power actually resides, more importantly. That you're trying to look at policies not just as arcane bill number 180755, but like a big campaign for economic justice rights that pulls together a broad coalition of people who have not traditionally worked together. Elected officials convene tables very effectively, and when they do it right, you can build out the campaigns and the big, broad coalitions that elected you into office and keep you driving for bigger victories.
Great, thank you. So here's what we're gonna do. We have a little less than 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'm gonna invite you to go to a microphone and be succinct and concise and ask a question. I'm gonna ask the panel to take some notes. I got it. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I have 2 Slido questions already. Haha. That I want to read while you go to the microphone. So one is from our good friend Josh Lerner, Mr. Participatory Government and Budgeting. He asks, why are we so reluctant to look beyond the U.S. for new visions of democracy, to learn from others rather than struggle to imagine on our own? He gives a couple examples: National Citizens Assembly in Ireland, Community Empowerment Act in Scotland. There are lots of other places in the Global South as well. So why are we so insular when we're looking and reimagining other forms of democratic governance? And then There's also from the legendary Heather Booth, who we heard from a little bit this morning. And this goes to what you just said, Councilwoman. If we are discussing governing, how do we build co-governing? If we organize and elect people while driving the issues, how do we keep up accountability and support after the election? We're all about getting folks registered, getting them out to vote, get people in office, and then we all go home. So what is the task? And I think I saw Danny Cantor and Maurice Mitchell from Working Families, who do a really good job of instructing newly elected officials on how to read a city budget. It's like, we got to think about that stuff. So anyway, those two questions on the table. Let's take those two at the microphone.
Thank you so much for having this wonderful discussion. I'm Kelly from the Kirwan Institute, and I want to bring up a question that relates to what you said, Lorella, as well as what's been implicit with the entirety of the conversation, is how do we envision a path forward and navigate this tension between, our previous legacy, some of the Obama-era questions, as well as envisioning a new future? Because on one hand, we have to be very mindful of this history and the explicit disenfranchisement of communities of color, of women, of the poor, but also envisioning some new issues, right? So for example, technology and how governments are interacting with citizens. So what do you see as the fundamental bridge between that gap of our history, our legacy, and envisioning reforms that are truly new and relevant to our modern society?
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Steve Sinha. I'm founder and executive director of Empowered to Run. Our focus is on how might we train thoughtful leaders everywhere to run for office successfully and govern effectively. So I love this panel, huge fan. The original provocation for this panel, as it was laid out, was good governance or inclusive populism.
I avoided that on purpose, but continue.
So the question that I have is basically, how can inclusive populism be rooted in the technical evidence-based policy and drive efficient, effective, responsive government? I love the idea of co-creation and co-governance, but if we look to some of the work out of, written in State Capture about how state policy network connects with AFP as well as with ALEC, what do we do on our side? I mean, we have EARN and we have state priorities partnership. How do we actually connect that technical aspect back to the movement side as well, so that we actually can drive the actual policy in the end?
It's a nice little stack of questions. Who wants to jump in?
So I'll say for the first question on the Slido, why don't we look beyond the U.S.? I still think it's because it's back to that old thing. I think we are typically oppositional. We see things in binaries. So it's oppositional. What's this? What isn't here? I think we see it as hierarchical. I think we have a horrendous affliction with romanticized sentimentalism. So, we're never going back. We're never going backwards. Going back was never great for a whole lot of people. So I release myself from romanticized sentimentalism about history and politics and people, most essentially. But I do think that there's another reason why we don't typically look beyond the politics of the U.S. And that's because I think we are also infected with the politics of celebrity, that we have created a cult of personality around leadership, and that what you see in many places, we had a chance to go to Barcelona and meet Barcelona and Camus in 2017, is that there's a much more like responsiveness and responsibility around platform-based people where, in the most ideal sense, we're all interchangeable. You're following a vision and a platform, and you should be loyal and adhere to it, and you should evolve it to bigger things. But you're not there for yourself. And this isn't about, like, who's the best looking, who got the biggest zinger in on the debate stage, who's ready to, blow it up by crowd surfing, I don't know, at a tech conference. All this kind of stuff is like, it's insane. It's like, people do not understand it from outside the United States of America. Why are you so obsessed with your politicians when they aren't that precious? And so, okay, so that's one. you know, on this question about inclusive, so there's like policy and inclusive populism. So obviously, like, you can, I don't even understand one without the other, but that has a lot to do with we had to form a lot of, like, when I was fighting around public schools, we had a state takeover body. There was no democratic governance at all. They got rid of our entire school board. They would close down public schools. They fired all the nurses. They let them all go. We had kids die of asthma attacks in schools without nurses. We had to become both the populist, moral mob, bluntly, because we had to scare the shit out of people. And then we also had to weave it in with real policy solutions. Like, what's your better answer? You know, what do you have to do? How does the budget come in? But fundamentally, like, I want to be careful because I don't think, like, teaching people how to govern, yes, of course, you know, learn how to read a budget, read your CAFRE reports, do this and that, show up for your hearings, don't be late, call people back, call your donors, da-da-da-da-da. Those are fundamentally, like, your technicalities of governance. You still need, like, a fundamental understanding. Budgets are not about the line items. Budgets are moral documents. You are trying to move a sense that if you switch line items, you are changing the way people live their lives. And it is your responsibility as an elected official to work with other communities to share that message. If you, the elected official, only echoes that, sure, go ahead. You're one of 17, go on your Facebook, YouTube channel, whatever, say your thing, and then maybe people will pay attention. But if you are echoed by the very communities who could be impacted, now you're starting to make change. Now a budget document comes alive. Now a budget hearing is worth taking time off from and showing up for and telling your neighbor, show up for this type of thing. And then maybe it's an opening to other types of things. And so fundamentally, I think, like, what policy folks could learn from this is that you have to have the drivers of your policy be the people who are deeply impacted. So coalition building, groups and organizations, young people, getting this story out to them, helping them live it, not having them be your sort of like stars or your stories or, you know, like the anecdotal to prove that this is, no, they are the drivers of this. They define how this moves in communities. They tell the media narrative. They are at the front of it. The more that policy lives in our policy worlds, the more it just becomes another policy to be batted around. Maybe it's a priority, maybe it's not. It all depends. But when the people get involved, the people are what makes something a priority. Things don't move because they are logical, sane, economically just, or because they're the right thing to do. They make it because other people cannot look away or walk away from an issue. And that's, I think, how we start to change up some of this stuff.
So can I just add, yes, amen. Can I just add to the other three of you, because I was half joking about the inclusive populism, and it occurs to me this relates to Josh Lerner's question, because exclusive or exclusionary populism is on the rise around the world, not just here. And one of the things I deeply believe makes a difference are the rules of the game. And so I actually want to put the rules of the game on the table that we take for granted. Why not mandatory voting? Why not proportional representation? Remember when President Clinton nominated Lonnie Guinier back in the day, and she got, right, not confirmed because she had this crazy idea of multi-member districts and proportional representation, and it's not the sexy thing to talk about, but the rules matter, right? So why do we have single-member districts? Why do we still have an electoral college? What are the rules of our democratic institutions that we can actually put on the table that would make a difference for whether we continue to be a democracy of exclusionary populism or inclusionary populism? So I'm just adding that to your stack.
And so I want to add, because it directly follows from, I think, both of these last two conversations around the question on inclusive populism. And I noted the language in the question: how can inclusive populism be rooted in evidence-based policy, efficient, effective governance? And, you know, the language immediately stood out to me, because what I thought was, you know, as someone whose part of my job is to produce the evidence base for evidence-based policy, what I thought was, you know, who gets to decide what counts as evidence, right? And do you know, alternative forms of knowledge, for example, rooted in people's experience, does that count as evidence? And who's going to sort out when there's evidence missing, right? When we don't have the research on proportional representation, or when we don't have the research on multi-member districts, or, well, then we're going to have all the research that points us in a different direction, and it's the evidence. But there's a whole nother body of evidence missing. Who determines what's efficient, right? Closing down public schools in Chicago and Philadelphia and cities all across the country. Well, that's efficient. We have these buildings open. They're not schooling that many children. I mean, let's close them down. But efficient for whom? In whose eyes, right? And what about the status of those institutions as core community institutions and the profound loss that comes from eliminating them, right? Effective. What is effective governance? Effective for whom? So I think, the inclusive part means that even when we think about these things like evidence-based policy and efficiency and effectiveness and even governance, right? That infused in the very process of thinking about and defining what these things mean are the voices and the perspective and the input of the communities and various kinds of communities, right? Not that we just turn community into one thing and thereby sort of exclude people by making community a singular thing, but those communities actually informing what that question even means is inclusive populism, in my view, right? Okay, I'll stop there.
So I would just add quickly, agreeing with everything Jamila said, which is usual. But I want to sharpen and deepen that a little bit by making some specific recommendations for what that would look like on the ground. I think it means deepening and broadening the access to the sort of policy information and resources that elected officials have. That means doing it both inside of government, for instance, providing additional staff or agencies that can supply lawmakers with information about the policies that they're developing and that they may be considering to pass, and also deepening the capacity of organizations outside of government that are representing a broader array of voices like the ones that Jamila just explained. And Steve mentioned some of the great networks that are out there already, the State Priorities Partnership and the Economic Analysis and Research Network. And I think, deepening those kinds of institutions that are working tirelessly day in and day out, providing honest numbers about the effects of policies on different constituencies and working closely with those constituencies are what we would need to assure both inclusive populism but also more effective governance.
I think I agree with everything. So the only things I would add, one of my favorite quotes by AOC is that we have to have the courage to write ourselves into the future. And I think that one of the themes today has been that democracy is a thing that we get to make ourselves. And so there, in order to answer, some of these questions, I don't think we get there without people power. Right? This idea that really, I just left the ACLU and I felt very much like, the ACLU had this project to really build its people power capacity because it understood that policy on its own couldn't actually deliver. And I feel that's the same way and even more strongly today than ever. And so I don't think that there's a magical answer. I think we've got to do the hard work of doing deep organizing, of really building, of changing the way that people understand themselves and their future, right? And creating the possibility for them and with them that the future does not have to be what it is today, that it can be different and that we get to shape it and we get to make it. But frankly, I don't think we get there either without some real talk in the mix, right? And so we have to heal as well. And I keep on thinking about the 1619 and the project and all of these questions that are coming up and what we're wrestling with as a country in terms of our history. And I think about the Obama legacy that brought a lot of really big changes for a lot of us, including DACA recipients, and it also did a lot of harm, right? It deported more people than we've ever seen under any administration. And so we've got to be able to call that out, and we have to push our elected officials, right, to a higher standard. I don't owe anyone on the Hill anything, right? We put them in there, right? They are accountable to us. And the more work that we do to make sure that more people understand that that is our power, that the power that we have as people is that we got to put you in office and we have the power to vote you out, then you have to deliver what it is we're putting on the table as our demands for us. Right? So we've got to get real about our history and the harm that it has caused. We've got to build powerful movements that are going to make the policy possible, that is going to shape the policy. And we have to expand and have an expectation that the imagination for our elected officials of what is possible has to radically, right, be radically different than the way they've been approaching policy making to date.
Lorella, Helen, Jamila, Alex, thank you for this very vigorous conversation. I just want to note to the organizers and Kevin and the other moderators, we ended on time. So step it up. Next, who's up next for Megan's panel? Let me turn it over to my friend and colleague, Lisa Garcia.